Welcome to Next Time podcast. My name is Sundar. I lead the forensic services at Next Time. This podcast is part of Global Anti-Corruption series. Our podcast is an endeavor to bring up emerging topics of relevance for executives across spectrum of services we offer. Hope you enjoy the podcast. Across geographies, regulatory environments are changing, business practices are changing, and behaviors are changing with COVID. Anti-corruption in current environment is bringing newer dimension with issues around supply chain, healthcare, and other reporting requirements. This also extends to regulatory interventions and the whole new virtual world that we are in. In this podcast series, we'll be interviewing specialists across regions to gather specific insights on anti-corruption in current times. The region we would get covered today is Middle East and Africa region. Today we have with us Orlando and Lolan. Orlando is the disputes and investigation partner in Norton Rose. He's based out of Dubai office. He handles matters relating to internal investigation and anti-corruption compliance reviews. He's a former US federal prosecutor and he heads the Middle East regulatory and investigation practice for Norton Rose. Lolan is an investigation lawyer. He works with Orlando on white-collar crime matters. Orlando and Lolan, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Sundar.
Thank you, Sundar.
So, Orlando, I just wanted to start with this. In this past 3 to 4 months, a lot of things have changed, including the way businesses work, the way risks are perceived. In this current context, how do you perceive corruption risks in the region that you operate in?
Well, that's really a very good question, Sundar. The ongoing COVID-19 crisis and the global shift to remote working create both the internal and external sources of anti-corruption risk, I would say, for companies. And this is what I mean. I guess I mean two things. First, the shift to remote working poses challenges for a company's internal control environment. Many companies have employees working remotely and have to adopt their management and supervisory practices to ensure employees are adhering to the same standards as before, and that's really very challenging. How do you make sure your employees are maintaining the same standards as before? For example, standards of confidentiality. With the shift from in-person to virtual meetings, how do you know your employees are not engaging in improper conversations online with government officials? How do you make sure that employees are not using WhatsApp and other ephemeral messaging platforms to discuss illicit activity? Technology can assist companies with monitoring day-to-day activities on employees' devices, but companies would have to think through how to monitor those without infringing on employees' rights to privacy. The second thing I would say is that a major source is external, because companies have become increasingly reliant on technological tools in business. Companies, not just in this region, but really across the world, are more exposed to cyber security risks. Earlier this year, for example, the FBI had cause to warn us all of the risk of Zoom bombing, that practice of hackers infiltrating Zoom meetings and sharing offensive content with participants. That kind of practice may seem relatively benign, but it highlights the risk that as more and more of a company employees really are online for longer periods of time, there are more touch points through which hackers and other criminals can infiltrate a company's cybersecurity infrastructure. One of my partners is currently assisting a company with a response to a ransomware attack, and she tells me those are very much on the rise in the UAE. That's an example of the more serious types of risks that companies face during this period. Sundar?
Absolutely, Orlando. I think the risk dynamics are changing rapidly, and it's very difficult for us to say how how long these circumstances are going to stay, and how it's going to reflect upon business. It is necessary for businesses to keep looking at their risks. With it, I just want to shift a bit and then ask Lolan about how do you see that the COVID related specific risks of corruption emerging in the regions? So there are risks that contributes significantly is contributed significantly because of COVID, and there are risks which are otherwise which have enhanced during the COVID scenario. How do you see the first one? Is what I wanted to get a perspective of.
Sundar, as Orlando said, we are seeing a lot of more cyber related incidents and cyber risks. But another risk area which has perhaps been exacerbated as a result of COVID, especially in this region, is money laundering risk. So, as some of your listeners may know, the UAE is one of the world's major trade hubs. Dubai, in particular, is a hub for re exporting goods from North America, Asia Pacific, and Africa to Europe and the Gulf, and vice versa. Um, and the Financial Action Task Force has recently pointed out in its mutual evaluation report on the UAE that the infrastructure the UAE has built to facilitate this trading activity, so to serve as this vibrant trade hub, and that comes in the form of the over 40 free zones in this country, can also be a source of corruption risk because the different free zones have different approaches to collecting beneficial ownership information for companies operating within their jurisdiction. And because of these different standards and regulatory inconsistencies, there could be some loopholes that criminals could exploit. So, in light of that, the DFSA, the Central Bank of the UAE, and several other regulators came out with some guidance in May, pointing out to financial services companies and other service providers that it may be more difficult during this time for businesses to um, adhere to their existing customer identification and verification processes in seeking to meet customer due diligence obligations, particularly where institutions have adopted remote working models. So that speaks to a point that Orlando raised. We are all working remotely. Officials at banks may also be working remotely. How do they verify that the customer who comes to open an account, is actually who he says he is and owns a company he says he owns, and isn't a front for someone who is involved in some illicit activity on the back end? So financial institutions in particular have to be very vigilant and ensure that they conduct very thorough due diligence on the beneficial ownership of companies they onboard.
Absolutely.
Now another risk which has perhaps been triggered by COVID is the risk of an increase in financial fraud and exploitation scams. And in this region, some of it has come through illicit fundraising for charitable causes that do not have a government permit. Now, to raise money for charities in this region, you need a government permit, but there have been all sorts of adverts online asking people to donate, to feed hungry children during this time, or to donate to provide supplies, and they have not been sanctioned. And there have also been phishing scams, and again, that speaks to the cybersecurity risk. There are so many more people online, so there are many more touch points for cyber criminals to try to get into an organization's IT network. So those are some of the risks that we are seeing that are specific to COVID in this region.
Absolutely. Lulan, and some of the points that you mentioned specifically in terms of the cybersecurity risks and the risks caused with regard to charities are very, very important. This is also something very, very peculiar to the way the region works. I just want to shift gears and then go back to Orlando and then understand from him on something that is very important is the change in government touch points. See, with one of the things that has happened with COVID is that there is a lot of reporting requirements that has come in where companies which only had a limited touch point in reporting with the government now have to report to government on their health and hygiene and also other matters, right? This is with this there is, and the government has also started purchasing a lot. There is government procurement contracts, a number of companies are participating in it, right? So with the increase in government touch point, there is a risk of corruption that comes in. How do you see that evolving in this region?
I would say that UAE government regulators, and it's really a factual statement, have historically been much less active than their counterparts in developed markets in other parts of the world, and that I have not seen it actually change in the COVID area. Um, uh, while the government imposed a very strict lockdown between April and May, the lockdown has been mostly lifted in Dubai. And it's not surprising because the Emirates economy is heavily dependent on trade and retail activity. Um, Dubai's police force recently collaborated with the FBI in the arrest and deportation of Dubai-based cyber criminal Raymond Abbas, as it's been covered in the press, which is an indication, perhaps, that the UAE authorities continue to monitor cyber activity closely and are cooperating with other regulators, in this case, the United States specifically. Um, Dubai and Abu Dhabi authorities have both launched COVID tracking apps, and it is possible that the authorities may eventually decide to deploy some of this technology to track other activities, including business activities in the UAE. Some of your listeners may know the UAE has a highly sophisticated biometric residence permit system, and it's really not a stretch to imagine that the different cases, different uses may arise from that technology. Different uses may be developed to deploy some of this technology and surveillance in other contexts. And again, one of them may be in closer monitoring of business activities.
Perfect. I think that's really relevant point, Orlando. I think some of these changes will have its own implications as things evolve. And you did mention about one of the points. I just wanted to touch upon that and then seek inputs from Lolan on it. Specifically on this point where you started with saying that remote working, one of the challenges is that monitoring internal controls becomes difficult. So, with that said, with remote working kind of environment, lockdown, and a lot of healthcare focus, how the context of corruption is changing in the way we see things. Lolan, would you want to take it up and then share your inputs on this?
Yes, that's a very good question, Sundar. So, as some of our listeners may be aware, the UAE has a very vibrant healthcare sector. So there are several healthcare providers and pharmaceutical companies operating in the UAE, and there is a very active and profitable healthcare tourism sector in the UAE. So before the crisis hit, some reports forecast that there was going to be a 5.5% yearly growth rate in the healthcare tourism industry, and that Dubai alone would attract about 550,000 visitors for medical tourism this year. Now, obviously, with COVID and the restrictions on travel, that can happen. But what we are seeing happen in the healthcare industry here is healthcare providers particularly um, who are not primary healthcare providers and having to deal with the burden of COVID. So private healthcare providers are starting to embrace telemedicine um, more and more to be able to deliver consultations to their patients. Now, just going back to your question about cybersecurity, the risk that poses is, of course, that patients' data could end up in the hands of the wrong people. And the UAE has been very sensitive to those risks. And so there's already a healthcare data privacy law in the UAE, which sets very specific rules and restrictions around what sort of data you can hold, where you can hold it, and how you can transfer it. So that is one particular challenge that healthcare-based companies in the region have to deal with. That's healthcare providers. Speaking about pharmaceutical companies, and a lot of our clients are pharmaceutical companies, the sorts of corruption risks they would be facing in the context of this crisis are mainly linked to procurement. So, because of the crisis and the need for PPEs and other medical supplies, you'll find that in a lot of countries, third parties pop up all of a sudden to just for the purpose or the sole purpose of procuring some of these supplies and trying to sell them on to governments or private health facilities in other countries. And what healthcare companies need to really guard against is the risk that some of these companies, these third parties, may procure their drugs or their safety equipment, their PPEs, and then hoard them and engage in price gouging when the demand for these supplies increases. And that brings to the forefront one key issue for compliance officers. You need to ensure that your company is not only trying to prevent explicit bribery and corruption, but is also thinking about how it wants to be viewed in the global community, and thinking about promoting an ethical approach to doing business. So, at a time when the entire world really is struggling, with this crisis, it will not be viewed as ethical conduct to facilitate an arrangement where the prices of your goods and products are hiked up, and they only go to people with the most amount of money, the highest bidder.
Absolutely.
So that is a risk which is a bit unconventional, but is more pronounced at this time, and that companies need to guard against also when supplying their medical products. So I think there are quite challenging issues that healthcare companies have to face during this time.
That's true, Lolan. I think that's absolutely true in terms of how the newer kind of challenges are coming in, specifically with regard to corruption in the healthcare environment. With that, I just wanted to go back to Orlando and then get his perspective. Orlando, how do you see the regulatory changes and the enforcement action? I think you did mention in the conversation earlier that the regulators are working with FBI to see how they can cooperate for integrated actions. How do you see that in the region as a whole, not just in UAE, but in the region as a whole?
Like it or not, Sunder, the United States, and if I can say so without sounding too chauvinistic, being an American myself, remains the leader in in regulation and enforcement of anti-corruption globally. And the DOJ has been recently very busy, at least very busy, updating its policies and procedures. Most recently, the DOJ has updated its evaluation of corporate compliance guidance, and to me that signals that the DOJ and perhaps other global regulators will be paying more attention to companies' compliance programs than ever before. Uh, Regulators will examine compliance programs in more detail when deciding what fines and other penalties to impose on companies found to have breached global corruption laws. So, and that's actually the biggest message that we are getting from the recent new additions and amendments to DOJ guidance, policies, and procedures, that the DOJ will be looking much more closely at at companies' compliance programs and how they change over time, and how companies track the effectiveness of their compliance programs and track them really with real data and real metrics, both qualitative and quantitative.
Um, Sundar, just to add to what Orlando said, the UK authorities are also taking a similar approach. So the DOJ provides more detailed guidance about how it will evaluate corporate compliance programs and its evaluation of corporate compliance guidelines. But the UK authorities recently agreed um, DPA with G4S, the global security company. And even though they only fined them 44.8 million, the judge who approved the DPA said the compliance measures in that DPA are some of the most stringent he has ever seen. So that tells you that it's not just the DOJ, the UK authorities are taking a similar approach. And as we saw in the Airbus matter, the UK, the US, and France work closely together. So the standards set by the DOJ, I think we can expect to be reflected in other jurisdictions globally.
Absolutely, absolutely, and that's absolutely true because we're seeing international cooperation and heightened enforcement action between regulators across geographies, and that's going to, anyways, bring in a more active enforcement regime in many regions. And what I hear from you guys is that you're expecting more enforcement in the region per se, the MENA as a whole region. With that, I think we're coming to the close of the podcast. I just wanted to ask both of you, Orlando and Lolan, about what are the three things that you think is important for compliance officers to consider in the current time. Um, that's who are operating in this particular region. That's the thing that would be really helpful for the listeners.
Okay, so that's a very good question. I think the first thing compliance officers need to know or need to do is that they need to update their company's risk assessment in light of the evolving anti-corruption risks in the current environment. So the message that the DOJ and other regulators are sending is that it's not enough to just take a snapshot of the state of risk exposure of your company at a particular time, let's say at the beginning of the year or at the point where you engage a third party. You need to continually update that risk assessment and feed the updates in the risk assessment into your company's compliance program. Um, I'll say the second key point that compliance officers should note is that they need to collect real time data on the effectiveness of their compliance programs. So it's not enough to just provide training for your employees, to provide a hotline for your employees to report allegations on. For example, you need to measure whether or not your employees have understood the training you've provided and whether or not your employees understand the reporting hotline and are using it? If they are not, are they asking questions? Do they understand your policies and programs? So you have to collect that real-time data and document it rigorously. And Orlando, do you have one more point to wrap us up with?
I do, but I think Sander asked us for 6 points. So, and there are plenty to there are plenty to
Of course, there are plenty.
there are plenty to discuss. Let me emphasize some of the things that Lolan has said, and then add to them, and hopefully they all add up to 6. The DOJ has, which I think is valuable and probably will be replicated by other regulators globally, is that they have recently emphasized that it's important not only to manage a relationship pre acquisition and the pre mergers, M&A due diligence process, but also engage in post acquisition due diligence and real integration efforts, and they will be looking to see how effective their compliance programs are when viewed through out the lifespan of a relationship with a third party, with your partners, with your local distributors, with the companies that you acquire in a merger, for example. So that would be one thing to stress. Another thing is that, and perhaps Lolan mentioned it, but it's worth emphasizing that the use of data, every day that passes, there is more and more data, and regulators, and certainly the DOJ in the US, is looking to companies to access and use that data to improve companies' compliance programs. I would also say, and yes, Lolan did mention that it's no longer enough to have a snapshot approach. It's not like you can write a compliance policy and put it on the shelf and be done with it. This is something that will never end. That's the burden on companies and on compliance officers in particular. They are to constantly be reviewing and updating and improving their compliance programs. So, and maybe the last thing I would mention is that, and again, from the DOJ point of view, there is a discussion in the recent documents issued by the DOJ on the impact of foreign laws, foreign, of course, when viewed from the perspective of the United States. And the DOJ has indicated some better understanding that sometimes foreign laws require companies to do things differently in foreign jurisdictions. It seems obvious and natural, but it's taken a while for the DOJ to, it appears, to realize that fully. And what the DOJ would expect is that if a compliance program has to deviate somewhat from what they would otherwise have expected from the United States just to comply with those foreign laws, that the compliance officers in those jurisdictions review this and evaluate it and justify it in case there is ever a regulatory event, an investigation, and the question comes up, why are you doing it differently where you are operating? There's probably a lot more takeaways, but I hope we've given you 6 under.
Absolutely, Orlando. Thanks a lot. And I think both the data-driven approach to looking at compliance and also the other point that you mentioned, which is very interesting, is track your incident management. Be consistent with the way you take decisions and you treat decisions on compliance matters. Both of these are going to be very, very critical in the broader context. I really appreciate you joining this podcast and then contributing to content for the compliance requirements that may be there in the region. I thank you, and I look forward connecting with you again.
Our pleasure, Sundar. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Sundar.